In the autumn of 1811, in the limestone country of central Kentucky, a man was digging in the dark for the chemistry of war. He was a saltpeter miner. His job was to scrape mineral-rich dirt off a cave floor so it could be boiled down into the one ingredient an army cannot fight without: gunpowder. The country was sliding toward the War of 1812. Caves like this one were quietly becoming some of the most valuable real estate in the young United States. So he dug. Routine work. The same dull thud of a wooden shovel into packed clay, over and over all day long. And then the thud changed. One strike came back wrong. Hollow. Not the soft give of dirt, but the flat ring of something solid just beneath the surface. He cleared the clay away and found a slab of rock laid down deliberately, flat side up, the size of a small tabletop. Not a natural boulder. Placed. He pried it loose. Underneath was a hollow chamber cut into the cave floor, roughly 4 feet on a side, walled with stone. And inside it, sitting upright in the dark, was a woman. Her arms were folded. Her hands were tied with a small cord, set in her lap. Her skin had gone dark and hard against the bone. She had been there, in that position, in that silence, for a very long time. And she was almost perfectly preserved. What that miner could not have known, kneeling over a stone crypt with a shovel in his hand, is that he had just dug up the most famous corpse in American history. Over the next 100 years, this woman would be carried by wagon across a young country, charge admission like a sideshow, written about in newspapers in England and Scotland, displayed at not one but 2 World's Fairs in front of hundreds of thousands of people, and finally handed over to the most important museum in the United States. And then she would disappear. Not lost in a fire. Not stolen. She walked into the Smithsonian Institution, and the public never saw her again. For years, nobody could even say where inside the building she was. This video is about who she was, how she ended up on the grandest stages in the world, and exactly what happened to her behind those museum doors. Because the answer is worse than simply being lost. If unsolved history like this is what you came here for, subscribe before we go further. This kind of story does not travel well through the algorithm on its own. It needs you to tell it the channel is worth showing to other people. So let us go back to that cave. The first thing to clear up is the name on the tin. For 200 years, she has been called the Mammoth Cave Mummy, and that is how she was sold, and that is how the world knew her. But the crypt was almost certainly not inside Mammoth Cave itself. It was in a smaller cave a few miles away, a place the miners called Short Cave. So many preserved bodies came out of that area that locals started calling it Mummy Valley. Mammoth Cave was the famous attraction next door, the one with a name people recognized, so that is the name that stuck to her. Remember that, because it matters later. The legend and the location were never quite the same thing. When word of the discovery reached the surface, it went straight to the man who ran the operation, a cave manager named Archibald Miller. He understood immediately that he was holding something more valuable than saltpeter. The body was moved out of Short Cave and over to Mammoth Cave, where the real crowds were, and the owners of that cave, 2 businessmen named Hyman Gratz and Charles Wilkins, did the obvious thing. They put her on display. They set her near the entrance, in a wide chamber called the Rotunda, right where every tour passed. And the effect was instant. People came from across the country to stand in a cave and look at a woman who had been dead for centuries and still had her hair. Guides built their whole route around her. Mammoth Cave was already a wonder. Now it had a face. But not everyone was comfortable sharing the dark with her. The saltpeter miners were still working that cave, by candlelight, deep underground, during a war. And they began to refuse to work near the body. The story goes that they grew so uneasy with her sitting there in the rotunda that they walked off the job. To keep the operation running, the owners moved her deeper into the cave, into a passage that earned the nickname the Haunted Chamber. They tucked her into a recess in the wall, on a ledge, and that ledge has a name to this day. It is called Mummy's Seat. You can still see it on a tour. An empty stone shelf, named for a woman who has not sat there in over 200 years. Now who is she? This is where the grave starts to talk, because she had not been thrown into a hole. She had been buried with care and with wealth. Around her and inside 2 bags found with her was an inventory that reads like the estate of someone important. A woven cap, headdresses made from large feathers, strings of beads counted in the hundreds, an eagle claw pendant, a pendant made from the jaw of a bear, rattlesnake skins, one of them still carrying its rattles. Bundles of thread and twine, needles cut from bone and horn, whistles made from cane, and one object that would eventually give her the only name history remembers her by. A necklace strung with the small hooves of young deer. Fawn hooves. People do not bury a nobody like this. The effort, the materials, the deliberate sealed crypt under a play stone slab. Whoever she was, she mattered to the people who put her there. They wrapped her in 2 deerskins decorated with pale impressions of leaves and vines, then wrapped that in a sheet woven from the inner fibers of tree bark, and they set her down to sit forever. And then there are the 2 details that have never been comfortably explained. She had 2 wounds, one described between the ribs, near the backbone, and damage to one eye. We do not have a careful forensic report from 1811, so anything beyond that is guessing, and I am not going to invent a murder for you. But the wounds are part of the record, and they sit there unanswered the way the best parts of these stories always do. A woman buried like royalty, with a possible injury to her side and her eye, sealed under a stone in the dark. Her body itself defied what people expected. She was tall for her time, recorded at around 5 feet 10 inches. The preservation was so complete that her teeth were still white and even, and her hair was still on her head, cut short and described as a dark reddish color. Hold on to that hair, because it is about to send the whole story off a cliff, and we need to deal with it honestly. For the last century, that red hair and that height have been used to claim she was not Native American at all. You will find this everywhere online. The claim that she was Egyptian or European, or proof of some ancient transoceanic visitor who reached Kentucky thousands of years before Columbus. It is a tempting story. It is also not true. Reddish discoloration of hair is a known thing that happens to hair after death and long burial, and human hair varies more than people assume. Anthropologists who have actually studied the remains from these caves identify them as Native American, connected to ancient mound-building cultures who mined these caves for minerals long before Europeans arrived. The exotic version sells better. The real version is more interesting anyway, because it means ordinary people built tombs and honored their dead with this kind of ceremony in North America, on their own with nobody's help. No. How does a woman in a cave in Kentucky become a touring attraction? Enter a man named Nahum Ward. Ward was a wealthy businessman, born in Massachusetts, living in Marietta, Ohio. Around 1815, he visited Mammoth Cave as a tourist, saw the mummy, and recognized the same thing the cave owners had. This was money. He acquired her, loaded her into a rented wagon, and took her on a road. And here is where she stops being a local curiosity and becomes a national spectacle. Ward charged admission, 25 cents to come and look. He took her to Lexington, then pushed east, stopping in Cincinnati, in his own town of Marietta, then Boston, Philadelphia, New York. A dead woman from a Kentucky cave, riding across a young country in a wagon, drawing paying crowds in every city. There is even a surviving photograph card from this era, an old carte de visite, inscribed as the female mummy taken from the Mammoth Cave by Nahum Ward of Marietta, Ohio. The tour finally ended in Worcester, Massachusetts, and in 1817 she came to rest in the collection of the American Antiquarian Society, one of the oldest learned institutions in the country. She had gone from a saltpeter cave to a scholarly society in about 6 years. But she was not finished traveling. Not even close. By 1822, her fame had crossed the ocean. Newspapers in England and Scotland were running accounts of the Kentucky mummy and the strange crypt she came out of. A woman who had been buried in total obscurity, in the dark, under a rock, was now being read about by people on another continent. And she still did not have a name. For decades, she was just the mummy, or to the Mammoth Cave mummy. Then, around 1852, a writer named Nathaniel Parker Willis visited the Antiquarian Society, looked at her, and wrote about her with the flowery affection of his era. He called her, more or less, Kentucky's posthumous belle. He fixed onto that necklace of little deer hooves, and out of his writing the name finally settled onto her and never came off. Fawn hoof. That is the name. Not a tribe, not a translation, not anything she would have recognized. A name handed to her 40 years after her death by a sentimental author who liked the sound of it. It is the only name she has, and she did not choose it. Here is the open question I want you holding as we go into the last act. By the middle of the 1800s, fawn hoof had been dug up, displayed in a cave, carried across the country for profit, written about in 2 nations, and adopted by a scholarly society. She had been seen by an enormous number of people. So how does someone that visible end up vanishing completely? How do you lose the most famous mummy in America? The answer starts with her two greatest moments, the two biggest stages she ever stood on. The first was 1876. Philadelphia. The Centennial Exposition, the first official World's Fair held in the United States, thrown to celebrate 100 years since the Declaration of Independence. It was a colossal event. Millions of people came to see the future of the nation laid out in enormous halls. And among the exhibits, this ancient woman from a Kentucky cave was put on display before the crowds. The second was 1893. Chicago. The World's Columbian Exposition. If anything, it was even bigger, a fair so vast and so dazzling it permanently changed how Americans thought about cities and spectacle. And Fawn Hoof was there too, shown again to a sea of strangers. Sit with that for a second. The same body that a saltpeter miner uncovered with a wooden shovel in 1811 was, 80 years later, an exhibit at the grandest celebrations the country could mount. 2 World's Fairs. Hundreds of thousands of faces filing past her. She was, by any measure, a star. And then she went to Washington. Sometime in the late 1800s, around the era of those fairs, Fawn Hoof was transferred to the Smithsonian Institution. On paper, this is the happy ending. The most famous mummy in America, retired from the road and the fairgrounds, finally given a permanent home in the National Museum, where she would be cared for and studied and protected forever. She was displayed there for a while. Into about 1900, you could still go and see her. And then the public record of Fawn Hoof, the visible woman, the seated figure with the dark red hair, simply stops. Because of what the museum did to her. This is the part the title of this video is really about, and it is uglier than vanishing. After the turn of the century, the Smithsonian made a decision about Fawn Hoof. They decided that the preserved body, the actual mummy, the thing that had drawn crowds for nearly 100 years, was less scientifically useful than her bare skeleton. The thinking of the time was obsessed with measuring skulls and bones to sort human beings into races, a framework we now recognize as both wrong and harmful. And under that thinking, the flesh was an obstacle. So they removed it. They took the mummy apart. The skin, the wrapping, the form that had survived intact in a cave for centuries, and then survived a century of being hauled around the country, all of it was stripped away. The bones were separated, disarticulated, and put into a box. An official of the museum is quoted as saying, in essence, that the skeleton was worth more as evidence of race than the mummy was. They unmade her. The woman went into a container, and the container went onto a shelf, and the most famous corpse in America became a number. That is how you lose someone in plain sight. You do not misplace her. You reduce her to bones, file the bones in a back room, and let time do the rest. By the 1920s, nobody in the public-facing world could tell you where Fawn Hoof was. She had been one of the most looked-at objects in the country, and now she was a rumor with a question mark. And someone went looking. In 1926, the people campaigning to turn Mammoth Cave into a national park hired a publicity man named Ted Giles. His job was to build the legend, to gather up the great stories of the cave and sell them to the public and to Washington. And Fawn Hoof was the crown jewel of those stories. The problem was that the crown jewel had gone missing. Giles needed her, and nobody could produce her. So he started writing letters. He wrote to museums. He chased the trail across the country. The search itself became a news story. Newspapers picked it up nationwide, the Chicago Tribune among them, the hunt for the lost Mammoth Cave mummy. Some of those papers got the facts hilariously wrong, reporting that she had been some kind of Amazonian, inventing an origin out of thin air, which tells you how much the truth had already eroded. And then, after months of letters and dead ends, the trail closed. She was inside the Smithsonian the whole time. The disarticulated bones of Fawn Hoof were found in the museum's anthropology holdings, sitting in storage, in a box marked with an accession number. Box 4789. That is where the title meets reality, and where I have to be straight with you, because the truth is sharper than the legend. She was not lost forever. She was found. The bones were located, identified, accounted for. In the cold language of a museum catalog, Fawn Hoof is not missing at all. She has a number and an address. But ask yourself what was actually found. Not the woman. Not the seated figure with the folded arms and the cord around her hands and the necklace of fawn hoofs. Not the mummy that 2 World's Fairs lined up to see. That was destroyed in the early 1900s, and it is never coming back. What sits in box 4789 is a disassembled skeleton, taken apart on purpose, never put back together, never displayed again, never returned to a position of any dignity. The famous Mammoth Cave mummy, as a thing the public could see and recognize, did vanish into the Smithsonian. It just vanished by being unmade rather than misplaced. So the answer to nobody has seen it since is yes and no, and the no is the part that should bother you. The bones can be located by a curator. But the mummy, the actual woman who survived centuries in the dark and a century of relentless travel and two of the biggest crowds the country ever assembled, the mummy stopped existing the day the museum decided her skeleton was worth more than she was. There is one more piece, and you need it because it explains why so much of what you will read about her online is wrong. If you search for fawn hoof right now, you will find photographs. A preserved body curled on its side in a glass display case, often presented as her, as proof she still exists on view somewhere. That is not fawn hoof. That is a completely different person. Those images almost always show a mummy nicknamed Lost John, a Native American miner who was crushed by a falling boulder while digging for minerals inside Mammoth Cave thousands of years ago, and who was discovered in 1935, long after fawn hoof had already been taken apart. The internet has quietly swapped one body for another because people want a face to attach to the name, and fawn hoof no longer has one to give. So her legend wears a stranger's photograph. Think about the full arc of it. A woman is buried with honor and wealth by people who clearly loved her, sealed under a stone in the dark. Centuries later, a man with a shovel breaks that seal. She becomes a spectacle, a ticket, a wagon attraction, a newspaper sensation on 2 continents, a star of 2 world's fairs. She is given a name she never had. She is studied, admired, and finally trusted to the care of the nation's greatest museum. And in that care, she is taken apart, filed in a box, lost to the public, briefly hunted, technically found, and then left exactly as she was reduced, while the world goes on attaching her name to someone else's photograph. She was seen by more people than almost anyone of her era, and we do not even have her face. The crypt in Short Cave is empty. Mummy's seat in Mammoth Cave is an empty ledge with a sign. The Antiquarian Society moved on. The fairgrounds are long gone. And in a storage room in Washington, in a box numbered 4789, are the scattered bones of a woman whose real name nobody ever wrote down, who outlasted everything except the institution that promised to protect her. If you want more lost history like this, the discoveries that got famous and then quietly got erased, subscribe and stick around. There are more empty boxes with famous names on them than anyone wants to admit, and they are worth opening.